This is the Era website at era.app. This website uses a simple visual style, and so I'll probably focus more on small, simple details the website uses to still make itself feel well designed and coherent, even if it looks quite plain. I mean, I think they're leaning into that with this extremely empty space for the hero section. They're giving you a huge title to focus on, right? So it's not about quantity, it's about quality. The first thing that jumps out at me is this approach they've used where they've put these black bars behind your and wealth. I think this is a great example of doing a lot with a little, or an elegant solution. And that's because, first of all, they have this tagline, enter your wealth era. But then they split it up, right? And they do that with this visual background on certain words. So first of all, enter your wealth era is the full sort of tagline. And then they've highlighted your wealth, right? So they're immediately taking some of those words and relating them to you, the visitor. Also, if you take the opposite of that, as in take out your and wealth, you get enter era. And so that's the company. So they're saying your wealth, enter era. They're relating those two concepts of your wealth with this company era. So it's a very clever way of having basically three messages in one and highlighting the different messages with this simple treatment where they've got the black background and the light foreground. And I say light foreground rather than white foreground is because one of the good things about this hero section, it feels quite coherent, and part of the reason for that is that the colours are quite coherent. And so they've got this sort of teal, green-blue background. Then I assume that these blacks here, let me just check that. Okay, so these are actually flat, flat blacks. But you can see here this color used for the text here is a lighter version of this background color. And so they're not just saying using white, they're making it more feel coherent by linking this color back to the background color. I assume the same for this section down here. I also like this as a layout. I mean, this is not the sort of hero section you normally see on a website. Usually you'd see some kind of product image. Here they're really leaning into the tagline, and then especially with the layout, they're doing different things where they've got this sort of subheading, sub-tagline over here on the left. You might expect that to the right because it comes after the main headline or below, but they're using the space well in the sense that because they've focused all of your attention on this one thing, they can do things slightly differently. Things don't have to be where you expect them to be because there's nothing else to sort of distract your attention, you know. I also like that because the Era logo has this black background, they've also used that black background here against behind the Your and Wealth. So again, they're linking this hero section to the brand in a very simple way. It's also quite distinctive in the sense that this uses these sharp corners, right? They're not rounded at all. Same up here with this background for the main navigation. It's relatively rare to see sharp corners, especially when they're this in your face. They've lent into that and it makes it feel different. And it's quite a contrast. I mean, there are sharp corners in the typeface. So that is, they're matching that. I assume this is Helvetica. They're matching the sharp corners in the typeface. But also there's lots of round shapes here, right? So it's a very, because it's a sort of geometric typeface. There's a strong contrast there between the round geometric shapes of the letters, some of them at least, and the sharp corners of the backgrounds. So, like I say, these are simple choices, but they're all very intentional. And so even the act of leaving the corner radius sort of unrounded is an intentional act, and it really helps things to stand out, gives it more impact because we see a lot of rounded corners these days. Feels much more common, and so this feels like a sort of a bold choice, even though it's a simpler choice. I already mentioned this main navigation. I like this box, this white background behind the main navigation, helps it to stand out. It also ties into this sort of background shape that they're using elsewhere, so it makes it all feel very like a triangle, all feel more coherent. You can see here that white background is a slightly different shade, so it's actually lighter than the white background they use for the rest of the website. I quite like this because, first of all, you don't necessarily want to use pure white or very bright white for the background of a website because it takes up so much space. I mean, you can see how much more of the main website has a white background than this section. And so this is the right way around, that you have the brighter white take up less of the space, in this case is main navigation, because then it's going to be less blinding. You know, you're not going to be as hit by this white light, especially if you're viewing this in a dark environment. This is going to be a very bright website to look at. And so that they've reserved this lighter version for this main navigation, just so it stands out against the main background, which is quite nice, because you wouldn't assume, if you saw this up here on its own and that stayed where it was, it didn't scroll with you, you would probably assume that these are the same colors, but they're subtly different for good reason. I also like that the Get Started button does have a background, but against the hero section, it fades away into the background, so it's invisible. Once you scroll down, you start to see it. What I like about this is that, first of all, it doesn't distract from the main message. They're really leaning into this Enter Your Wealth era sort of impact. And so if they put lots of attention on the main call to action, the Get Started button, that might distract people from this main call to action, this main hero section down at the bottom. But also, when you're at the top of a website, you probably don't necessarily want to get started right away. You want to learn a bit more about the website or the company. I suspect in most cases that's true, unless you already know you want ERA, and so you're going here immediately. But in that case, they don't really need to attract your attention to it. It's only once you scroll past the hero section and get into this white section that suddenly the teal background comes into its own, gets the foreground treatment essentially, and stands out against the white website. Whereas this section, which was really standing out against the teal background, now blends in a lot more. Even though it's brighter, it still has less emphasis on it. They've changed the priority without actually changing the background colors, just by changing the page background color. And I think that's quite fantastic. Often you see a different approach where websites will have this sort of sticky navigation or this main call to action that scrolls with you, but they might change it a bit as you scroll. It'll be a scroll triggered animation or something. And they haven't done that here. They've figured out a way to make that happen without having to change the components. So that again feels very elegant. So they had this sort of big, bold, teal background hero section. They've gone into the white section, and now that lets them bring these other colors into the foreground. Again, this is an interesting choice, and I like it, but it's an interesting choice because usually I see these sorts of bright, colorful accent colors against darker backgrounds. When you've got them against a white background, they're not necessarily competing, but the white washes out these bright colors slightly. But because they're using so much of it and the graphics are so attractive, I really like this sort of two-tone approach they've got here, where all the pixels are either black or yellow. There's no extra colors. That gives it a very impactful feeling. I don't think the white, the brighter background around it really distracts from it, because this is very impactful. It sort of draws your attention. It's fun to look at. It's also nice that they spent the time, I assume they spent time, turning what I assume are sort of standard interface components into these more abstract, stylized approaches, where they've given it a lot of personality and flair, even though it's quite visually simple because it's just two colors. They spent the time to make it feel different, rather than just giving you screenshots of these cards as they would appear in the interface. I assume they don't look like this, although it would be fantastic if they'd gone that far and made them look like that. I quite like, along with the color here on the right in the big card where they want your attention, they've also got this color on the left, and so they've got a very small amount here, a very large amount here, but they're sort of echoing each other. They make this whole section feel like it's sort of themed. We might not see this color again further down the page, but just the fact they've used it twice in the same section makes it feel much more intentional, much more designed. It's like it's a theme, in the loop is the theme, and that's why they've gone for this background color. And so that's quite a simple way, just in the view we're looking at, to make these sections feel different. Here they've used yellow, here they've used purple, and so on. I didn't really call it out before, but I really enjoy this sort of, it's not quite dithering, it's like a pinstripe effect. But if you're only going to use black and the background color, in this case purple, and you want a way to show sort of half-tone shades, then this pinstripe effect is one way to do it. Things like dithering are another way to do it. But this is very stylized, and I think that works really well with the style of illustration they've gone for. It all fits nicely, and so I think the time they spent to create these illustrations was worth it. You can see here they've up here these are accent colors essentially. They've got this sort of bright blue-green. Down here they've got this much more neutral grey, but it's still treated as a color. You can see they've reflected it in the same way they did up here, even though the sort of layout is different. They've changed the layout from top to bottom for this title and this card, but they've kept this sort of category tag, and they still use the same pattern, even though they're shifting tone and they're using less distracting colors in the background. They're still keeping something, which is these patterns they've been using for these previous 3 sections. And so that's quite a nice way to shift the tone but still make everything feel like it belongs together, is use this at least one thing the same from the previous section, but maybe change the rest of it. In this case, that's the general use of color, but also the layout. They've still kept this sort of motif. I quite like this approach where everything that you have, everything that either Era works with or replaces. I can't quite tell. I think maybe they're trying to say that Era replaces these things or it integrates with them. It's not very clear, which maybe is an improvement they could make, because it's suggesting all-in-one suggests that they replace all these things. But I quite like the fact that they've put a background of white behind all of these tools it replaces or integrates with. At least it means that you don't have to use them as much. And they've put a black background behind the Era stuff. What's quite nice about that is that it's really highlighting the opposites or the differences between all of these tools and Era. They're saying those are all white, we're black, we're the opposite of them, we're very different. And I also quite like this because they've used the same sort of black treatment for the Era logo as they did up in the top left corner, and so that makes it feel that much more coherent and branded, even though it's quite a simple approach, right? You've got Era with a black background and then this list with a black background. It still feels like it's Era appropriate and reinforces the brand, as simple as it is, of the product. It seems like maybe this sort of light blue-grey colour is more of their neutral tone, and so they were shifting down so you could focus on the content here, rather than these much brighter colours, where you've got more specific details, because they continue that with pricing and then FAQs. I like these square black buttons. They're quite simple, but they match, again, the logo of the company. So it's quite nice, and maybe this is intentional, but it's quite nice that the way they've styled the logo for the company or the product lets them use the same style for buttons. That sort of subtly links the idea of getting started or the idea of leveling up with the product that you're potentially going to get started with or level up with. So that's quite a nice way to do it. And then in this hero section, I'm quite a fan of gigantic buttons. And so here they've taken up the, not hero section, the footer section. I'm quite a fan of these gigantic buttons in footer sections. And so here they've gone for it and used the whole width of the footer to put this gigantic get started button. And you're not going to miss it, right? So it doesn't matter that it's necessarily in the footer section after this divider, right? Most websites would put it up here and then they would change the tone of the website for the footer. Here, it's so big, there's no chance you're going to miss it, so they can put it against this black background where it's going to really shine because this is a bright, bold colour. If it was against the white background, like I was talking before, the white might sort of drown it out. But here you've got this huge teal button, massive arrow to tell you what's going to happen, get started. They really use the space. And that ties in with the general theme of the website where they've been very bold about their visual decisions. This just really reinforces that finally.